Okay, now it's the last part of the lecture, and it's about refugee, asylum seeker, and Islamophobia. And I think it's the most interesting part of the lecture. So a little bit, I just want to present a little bit of statistics and data here, and I think it's important for you to know. According to the UNHCR, the number of refugees by mid-2021, about 84 million people, they were forcibly displaced worldwide, and we can see 48 million are internally displaced people. That means they are displaced inside their own countries, but as a result of war or conflict, they are just kind of displaced. And also 4.4 million are asylum seeker as mid-2021. And you can see it's a huge number. So where the refugees globally come from and which are the host countries. It's interesting to note that 68% of refugees globally are originated just from 5 countries. And it's according to the UNHCR report by mid-2021. It may change by next year because of the Ukraine conflict. So the first country of birth for many of refugees is Syria, then it's Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. And the same 39% of hosted 30% of host countries. There are just 5 countries that host the refugees globally, and it's the first country that is Turkey, Colombia, Uganda, Pakistan, and Germany. And it's interesting to know that most of the host countries, they are from global south, and they've got their own problems. So though they've got lots of problems of their own countries like poverty, and they are not very developed countries, but they still host lots of refugees in the world in comparison with Western world. So it's again, it's very interesting data that how many refugees come to Australia. If you ask many people, they think probably it's millions and millions of refugees that arrive in Australia, but we can see since 1901, the whole number, the total number of refugees in Australia is less than 1 million. So it's around 928,000. So refugees that settle as an immigrant since January 1901 to June 1948, they were just 20,000. And assisted humanitarian arrivals between 1947-48 to 1947-74 to 75, about 264,000. And again, you can see the number. It's really, really low. So in general, it's just less than 1 million. So there is some confusion about the misinformation about the terms asylum seeker, refugees, illegal, queue jumpers, and boat people. And unfortunately, I heard many of even some academics and some highly educated people still call the people who are seeking asylum or refugee as boat people or illegal. So it's very important to be mindful that these people are eligible asylum seeker and refugees. So Australia is a signatory to the 1951 United Nations Convention and the 1967 UN Protocol on the Status of Refugees, which defines a refugee as a person. So it's a very one of the best definition of refugee according to the UN. So a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reason of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social groups or political opinion, is outside the country of his or her nationality, and is unable to, or owing to such a fear, is unwillingly to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country. So you can see there can be lots of bases for seeking asylum and refuge. It can be based on political opinion, it can be based on the nationality, religion, race, and also even sexuality. So Each year, the Australian government allocates around 13,750 places to refugees under its humanitarian program. So it's very small amount in comparison with 8 million refugees. We just get 13,000 a year. And the last 2 years, because of the COVID, the number of refugees, significantly decreased. So, and this number, it's usually allocated by UN, but the government and the signatory need to agree with the number. So who is asylum seeker? Asylum seeker is a person who wishes to be recognized as a refugee and be granted protection under the term of the above 1951 UN Convention. So they wish to be recognized as a refugee, but they are not recognized as a refugee. And only it's very important to keep in mind that only a tiny proportion of asylum applicants in Australia arrive by boat. So it is the assumption that all the asylum seekers come by boat, but most arrive by air with a valid visa. Also, refugees who come to Australia, they are all, when they come, most of the majority are come by airplane. They've got valid visa and they've got Medicare. So when they arrive, they've got, they are permanent resident. So they are, after a while, even there is a discussion, should we call them refugees? Because after a while, they get Australian citizen. So there is some misinformation about these refugees and asylum seekers. So it's a brief history of offshore processing, that how it's about asylum seekers, not the refugees. In 1992, the mandatory detention is introduced for non-citizens who arrive without a visa. So in Australia, no one can arrive without the visa, unlike some countries like the US that many people are illegal. They call them illegal migrant. But in Australia, everyone should have a visa. In 1992, temporary protection visa introduced. So it's a visa that people apply for, so they can stay in Australia temporarily until they apply for a permanent visa. 2000, it was an influx of asylum seekers that arrived by boat, mainly from Middle East, and they were held in mandatory detention. And 2001, there was a Pacific solution introduced, and asylum seekers are not detained on the mainland. It's not in Australia, but in Australian-funded detention camps in Pacific Islands. That is like Christmas Island. In 2007, the Rudd government abolishes the Pacific solution. It still has mandatory detention, offshore detention reinstated under Gillard government. In 2030, Abbott government introduced Operation Sovereign Borders to stop boats. 2014, Australia and Romania's Commission demanded national inquiry into children in detention, because in the detention center there were lots of children as well. And in early 2015, Human Rights Watch lists Australia as a country to watch for potential breaches of human rights in relation to treatment of asylum seekers. That is very sad. Late 2015, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture outlines 4 cases in which Australia breached the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman Treatment of Asylum Seekers in Detention Center. 2016, the United Nations repeated its claim that Australia's system of indefinite detention violates the human rights freedoms from arbitrary detention. 2016, Malcolm Turnbull makes the US resettlement deal, which is eventually honored by Trump. 2017-18, regional processing center on Christmas Island and Manus Island closed, but asylum remain in these communities, which was a concern about the condition they were living. And we could see, if you look at the social media and the stories, that what happens in the detention center is really sad and concerning. 2019 medical transfer bill passed, announcement that Christmas Island detention will reopen to deter new asylum seekers. So some changes happen. So if you look at this, you can pause the lecture now and watch this video. It's the summary of what I said, and it's look at the phenomena of asylum seeker and the treatment in Australia. This is the video. So the next thing we're going to talk is just about Islamophobia and how we define and conceptualize Islamophobia remains a contested question in academia. There's many definitions that have been criticized for being simplistic and too narrow focus on the negative attitude or emotions such as fear or hatred. So Allen, one of the theorists, argued that Islamophobia is not restricted to any specific action, practice, or discrimination, but is instead evident in a vast array of different social, political, and cultural processes, whereby the identification and recognition of Muslim and Islam as both other and problem are routinely consumed with a question or contestation. So, as I talked before, not just vilification of Muslim as the other, as a culture that causes problem, that a culture that is a threat to Australian culture is always consistent in the Australian society, unfortunately. And I find this picture is very, it's one of the good example of Islamophobia. You can see that the woman is just smoking, holding the coffee cup with one hand and using the mobile phone. And she's just complaining about, a woman that is just abiding the law and driving, but she's wearing the burqa. So it shows that how it's a sub aspect of Islamophobia. And again, it's the fear, as I mentioned, if any act of violence happens for months and months and for many a period of time, the Muslim community is going to be vilified for the action of one person. So it's another example of Islamophobia. So there are some data that is very interesting in analysis of 349 report of Islamophobia recorded over a 2-year period by the Sydney-based specialized NGO Islamophobia Register. So it's an NGO after some Islamophobic attacks and some public violence against Muslims, especially women. It was an NGO that organized the name Islamophobia Register. So ask Muslim community if they witness or they experience any kind of a racist attack, they need to register there. So based on the data, they just find that most of the Islamophobic attacks occur in public space and that women were vastly overrepresented as the target of Islamophobia. As we know that usually racism is more towards people who are more visible, like with the skin colors, and also usually Muslim women are the most target of Islamophobic attacks. And it's another point is that most of these attacks happen in public space, and it's another sad point that when it happens in public space, there are lots of witness, and usually sometimes the people intervene, but most of the time people don't intervene and just witness the abuse. And in a recent larger-scale survey among Australian Muslim, Rene, it's a survey 2020, it's very recent, found that the respondents' top 4 concern, the Muslim top 4 concern were all related to some manifestation of Islamophobia and racism. They were concerned about the media portrayal of Islam and Muslim. 96 concerned or very concerned about that, just the image of, hatred and, attribute Muslim with violence. Another concern for most of the Muslim were discrimination against Muslim, anti-Islam sentiments in the society, and right-wing terrorism that happens against Muslim. In 2014, it's another survey, 1 in 4 Australians held a negative attitude toward Muslim, and Muslim experienced discrimination at 3 times the rate of other Australians. So we can see that it's really, that it's 1 in 4 Australians held a negative attitude toward Muslim, and also the Muslim experience at 3 times rate of other Australians. So it's really high. It's not just some people think it's just the exaggeration, but the data shows no, it's real, and they experience more racism than other ethnic groups. Also, representative population survey have repeatedly found high level of negative attitude toward Muslim, between 25 to 40%. They have negative attitude toward Muslims. A range of media, and another thing that I want to talk is just that it's interesting that those Australians who had negative attitude toward Muslim, when they've been asked that, have you ever met a Muslim? Majority of them never met any Muslim, even in their family, among the friends, colleagues, or neighbors. They don't even know any Muslim, but they have negative attitude towards them. So it can be how it based off the Islamophobia rhetoric in the society and the media that can reinforce all of those things, or some public policy around, negative policies toward Muslims. And also, when we look at the media again, a range of media study conducted over the past 2 decades consistently confirmed that Muslim and Islam are often depicted in a biased way, often associated with violence and terrorism. So the name of the Islam and the violence, it just come linked to each other. And even if you look at the movies, unfortunately, if you studied any movie about the violence and war and those things, always the person who's committed all of those crimes is a guy that's Muslim. So another focus of media when it comes to the Muslim is just focusing on Muslim women as oppressed who need to be saved. That is very common. We can see this kind of a picture, and portrayal a lot. And we can see that saving the Muslim women can be even has been used to start a war in Afghanistan. And we know that the Laura Bush at that time just had a famous talk, and he said one of the main aim of this war and the US troop and allied and to go to Afghanistan to start the war is to save Afghan women. And now we can see after 20 years, they just left the Taliban, just left the country, and then the Taliban is governing the Afghanistan, and we can see the women not only been saved, they've got in worse situation. So it's just the excuse to just start a war. It's a political thing. So according to about some theories about cultural racism in Islam, one of the social theorists, Tariq Mahdud, argued that the basis of exclusion for the ethnic other in a Western state is determined by the extent to which a cultural group is seen as belonging. So when a moral panic about terrorism link fear of attack to Islam as a religion, this becomes a contemporary form of cultural racism. So Islamophobia defines it as a culture of cultural racism, and it's the word of belonging. So we can see that why Muslim people are just experience more racism in comparison with other groups, because it's the belief that they belong less, and it's because probably because there's more visual things, and we can see that the racism in different kind of ethnic minority is different. For example, those immigrant or refugee from Eastern European or European countries, they just experience less racism in comparison. But for example, people with African ethnicity or Muslims or Asian. So it's the assumption that the more people belong to the host culture, they are less experience racism, and they are less threat for the Australian or Western host country. And also there is a significant public fear of Islam in Australia. Broadbent found widespread support for the idea that Muslim Australians are potential terrorists, and yet Australia has so far seen only a very small number of cases and conviction of Islamic terrorism. So you can see between the 2001 and 2014, some 64 pieces of counter-terrorism legislation entered Australian law. So there are so many anti-terrorist law and policies that have been produced by the government. When we compare even there was a research done that compared the act of terrorism that conducted by Muslim with the domestic terrorism, that is the violence against women and homicide of women, intimate partner homicide. We can see which one is really, the number is not comparable. I mean, the whole number of terrorism by Muslim maybe is just less than 10 or even less than 5, but we can see at least one woman is killed, or every 9 days or 10 days one woman is killed by their partner. So we can see that it's it's very imbalanced between those policies and protection. So if we want to protect Australian community, we need more policies toward like other issues that we face, rather than terrorism, that is a very small number of terrorist acts that happen in Australia. Research also found that Australian Muslims predominantly support the principle and practice of democracy. It's based on the research that happened. As Ati and Don points out, there is no compelling empirical evidence in Australia to support the case for widespread radicalization or vulnerability to it among Muslims, nor is there evidence to suggest widespread alienation among Muslims. So there is no, they are not evidence-based and research-based. It's just as a propaganda and just a moral panic that, just spread through social media and some politician. The survey by RAIN found the Muslim both value their Islamic identity and actively seek to integrate into mainstream Australian society. And it seems that while negative media depiction has shaken the confidence of many, their trust in healthcare, education, and the judiciary remains high. So Australian Muslims, they've got a high allegiance and bonds toward all of those, loyalty toward all of those systems. And in short, like other Australian Muslim people, just want to get on with making prosperous and harmonious life with themselves and their family. And it's just other factors that I talk about just make the Islamophobia looks worse and worse. So in conclusion, we talk about the concept of race that is contested. There were some discussion about is the base of the race biology or culture. We talk about ethnicity and the interconnectedness of race and ethnicity. We look at some of the theories of ethnicity, and also we look at the intersectionality and hybridity. And at the end, we look at some data about asylum seekers and refugees in Australia and the phenomena of Islamophobia, that it's one of the challenge to social science research. So it's the end of the lecture, and I hope you just enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.